All right, so the way you're going to be taking notes today, same as what we've been doing for a lot of this unit. You're going to take a piece of paper, divide it into two columns, terms on one side, definitions on the other, and then upload your notes for full credit for this assignment. All right, so what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at labor unions. Now, you probably, or you may, shall we say, have some experience with this topic, and it does tend to be pretty controversial, so you probably have, or you might have, some opinions going into it. I'm going to say straight up, I am part of a union, so I do have a bias, so I'm going to say that and just be conscious of that as we're going through this. And then after this video, you guys are going to have a chance to do some research on both sides of the issue and share your opinions. So it's not just going to be me feeding you my opinion. All right, well, what is a labor union? You're like, wait a minute, it's controversial. I don't even know what this is. A labor union is an organization of workers that negotiates with employers for better wages, improved working conditions, and improved job security. So our plan for today is we're going to look at the history of labor unions in the United States. We're going to talk about how unions work. And then, as I mentioned, you're going to get a chance to research, well, how effective are unions really? So you're going to look at both sides of the issue. And then you're going to tell me your opinion. So if you have the chance, should you join a union? All right, so let's talk about the history. So in the United States, labor unions were formed in response to really terrible working conditions in the 1800s and early 1900s. So during the Industrial Revolution, if that time period rings a bell from world studies or US history. So oftentimes, way back when, workers worked really long hours in dangerous environments for very little pay. So one of the biggest examples of this that really galvanized people in the United States was something called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. And this was a fire in 1911, and it was at a workshop in New York City, and 140 garment workers died because management actually kept the doors locked as they were working. There were no fire exits, there were no fire procedures, and a lot of these workers who died were young immigrant women. So this really motivated a lot of people to make a change for working conditions. All right. Unions were really strong in the early 20th century in the United States, and they played a really important role in guaranteeing rights for workers such as weekends and lunch breaks and the 40-hour work week. So if you have those things at your job and you enjoy them, that probably came from a union putting pressure on employers or on the government. And unions also played a really important role in building a strong American middle class by negotiating for higher wages. Now, if you're like, hold up, wait a minute, my parents don't work 40 hours a week. Like, I'm working over 40 hours a week. Maybe I don't get a lunch break. You're like, hold up, I thought I had these protections from a union. Or you work on the weekend too. A lot of us do, right? You're like, I don't have those protections. Well, why not? Where did unions go wrong? So part of that has to do, it's not the whole reason, part of it has to do with the fact that unions are not as powerful as they used to be. So union membership has declined pretty substantially in the last few decades or so. So at its high point in the 1950s, it was about 35%, so about a third of the workforce was unionized. Today, only about 6.5% is unionized. So if you work at somewhere like Raley's, which is a union shop, you might belong to a union, but I'm betting a lot of you at your jobs probably don't belong to a union. Just because of that percentage there. Now, why did this happen? Why did unions decline? So part of it is because of employer and government opposition. So during like the 1930s and 1940s, a lot of legislation was passed that helped protect unions. But in recent decades, that legislation has been overturned either by Congress or by the Supreme Court. And then employers have pushed back against unions too. So just for example, actually, I'll go into it with the next one. So an additional reason why unions have declined in power is that there's been a decrease in manufacturing jobs, which traditionally are unionized, and an increase in service jobs, so things like food service and retail. So just as an example that kind of speaks to this point here, as well as this point here. So technically, employers are not supposed to discourage workers from joining a union, but some retail employers will do that. So for example, when I was in college and I worked at Staples, there was a sign in our break room that had a bunch of reasons why you were not supposed to join a union. So that highlights, right, that service jobs are typically not unionized, and it highlights that employer opposition there, right? Employers do not like unions very much. But there's also a third reason here, and this might be something that maybe it's an opinion that you hold or that that you've talked about with your family, unions are not looked upon as favorably as they used to be. So there definitely were some issues with unions, and you guys will be looking at that today when you do your research, like issues with corruption. Sometimes unions protect workers that maybe shouldn't be protected. So that has turned a lot of people against unions, and a lot of people have made the choice to either vote for candidates who support anti-union policies, or they've made the choice not to join a union themselves. All right. Well, let's talk about, before we get into sort of the goods and the bads, what do unions actually do? So unions, the whole point is that they represent workers when they negotiate with management. So in negotiations between labor and management, unions typically work for things like better wages and benefits. So when we talk benefits, we mean things like healthcare policies, sick leave, holidays, et cetera, et cetera. They negotiate for better working conditions. So maybe they'll negotiate for safety policies or reasonable hours. They'll also negotiate for job security. So unions will try and ensure that workers aren't just fired for no reason. So if the boss doesn't like your haircut, they can't just let you go. Unions will negotiate for policies like that. Unions will also try and negotiate and protect your right to join a union. And then finally, they'll also negotiate for procedures for resolving work-related disputes. So what does that look like? If you get in a fight with your boss or you think your boss is treating you unfairly, what are the steps that you can follow to ensure that you are protected at your job? Now, this process of negotiation is called collective bargaining, and that is when union and management representatives meet to discuss their goals and offer solutions and compromises. So typically it's a negotiation, right? The union's not getting everything they want for workers, and management is not getting everything it wants, right? They're reaching some kind of compromise. All right. But that doesn't always work, right? Sometimes one side digs in their heels because they're not getting what they want, and labor and management are unable to reach a compromise. The bargaining process breaks down. Now, sometimes what will happen is this will go to another step where a neutral third party is called in to negotiate and resolve the dispute. And this is called mediation or arbitration. There's a difference between those things, but I don't need you to know them right now. And then if that process fails, unions will use other tactics to try and get management to meet their demands. And we're going to look at 3 over the next few slides: strikes, boycotts, and picketing. All right, what's a strike? You might be familiar with this. Maybe you have gone on strike or you know someone who has. This is when union members stop working until their demands are met. So they just don't show up to work. They're like, we're not going to work until we get what we want, right? Oftentimes, workers will, if they're on strike, they might also participate in picketing. And this is when workers who are on strike stand outside their workplace and carry signs expressing their grievances, right? So like, for example, these are nurses who are on strike and they are picketing right now. So they are carrying a sign that says safe staffing ratios save lives. So you can tell, right, that what they are probably demanding is they want fewer patients to be assigned to a nurse. And they are arguing that not only is that a better working condition for nurses, right? So they're not overstressed, but they're also saying that it's better for patients here. So they're making an argument and they're trying to convince passersby outside the hospital to support the nurses in their strike. All right. Another tactic that unions might use is a boycott. And this is an organized effort to stop people from purchasing a business's products or using their services. So this is where unions are making the claim, right, that business is not protecting their workers. So everyone else in the public should try and hurt that business by not buying their products, essentially. So a really famous boycott happened in California. And this is when the United Farm Workers, which was a union that protected farm workers, they tried to get people to boycott farms that were not providing adequate or good working conditions for their farm workers. And these farms were selling grapes, so they organized a grape boycott.